I will try to cut my talk short to stick within the 15 minutes. And so 15 minutes from now, Chairman? Okay. I would like to begin by showing you a diagram that somewhat summarizes the mental image most people have of the field of Islamic economics and finance, and then I'll try to dissect it and show you that I believe our understanding is quite wrong. The idea most of us will have is that, of course, we have the Quran and the Sunnah, those are the nusus, the canonical Islamic texts, and then there are the ijma' and qiyas, which are sort of at the second tier, and then all sorts of other methods that jurists may use, which may be reclassified as forms of qiyas or reasoning by analogy, and then this gives us a somewhat fixed body of knowledge that we call Islamic jurisprudence that is somewhat certain. And then from that, the assumption is that that body of Islamic jurisprudence has determined once and for all that basically everything that is quote-unquote Western finance is un-Islamic, by definition almost, and that somehow there is an ideal Islamic form that may even be derived directly from those canonical texts, or at least from very strong juristic inference, that determine that those profit and loss sharing types of contracts, forms of silent partnership or full partnership, are the ideal Islamic financial contracts to use, but that jurists, for some reasons of their own, have decided to permit some short-term alternatives like credit sale financing, called murabaha, or bay' bithaman ajil, etc., lease financing, and so on. So that's the image most of us have in this industry when we look at it, and that's certainly the image you'll get, I'm sure, by listening to various speakers today and other conferences. But I would like to claim, actually, that the writings of Islamic economists have played a crucial role in deciding what goes in those boxes down there. That those are somewhat novel interpretations, rereadings of the text, so to speak, based on economic thought, and I dare say that a lot of it is not particularly good economics. The economic thought may come from jurists, or it may come from economists who classify themselves as Islamic economists, but it basically read into jurisprudence what's not really there. For instance, mudaraba, if you read writings in Islamic economics, you'd think that somehow you'd open books of hadith and find some hadith on mudaraba, or find some ayah in the Quran about mudaraba, because everybody's talking about it. But the reality is, as Ibn Taymiyyah said, for instance, that it's one of those contracts that has absolutely no basis in those canonical texts. And when you see people trying to refer to some verse in the Quran, وَضْرِبُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ or something, and that phrase doesn't say anything about mudaraba as the contract that you have now. It's really just trying to play linguistic games. So I would argue that actually all of current Islamic finance and the understandings people have that profit and loss sharing is the essence of Islamic finance, and that everything that's built on credit or debt is un-Islamic in some way and maybe tolerated only as a short-term solution, that's a fiction that was created in the middle of the last century, and it's a fiction that has no basis in Islamic jurisprudence, certainly in the Islamic canonical texts. So what did the historical Islamic economics do, either written by economists or by jurists? The first thing they did was to determine that the illah, or the instigating factors in certain prohibitions that are there. Obviously, the prohibition of riba is in the Quran as well as in the hadith. The prohibition of gharar is in the hadith, and there are some references people may infer from the Quran. But certainly the instigating factors in what makes certain contracts ribawi, or forbidden based on riba, or forbidden based on gharar, both the instigating factor from a juristic point of view as well as the hikmah, or the wisdom that can be understood from a social point of view, were recolored by those writings of Islamic economists. And they influenced jurists, convincing them that those were indeed the instigating factors and objectives behind those prohibitions. And I'm going to give you examples of this in a little while. So for instance, in the case of riba, and I've talked about this in previous conferences, I don't know how many people here have attended my previous talks, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but I'll give you a reference. For instance, there is the myth that, and the late Dr. Ahmed al-Najjar, for instance, in many of his writings said this, if the rate of return is fixed and the time period is fixed, that is interest, that is riba. But you look at those permitted contracts, like a lease to purchase, or a credit sale with deferment, etc., they all have fixed rates of return, they all have fixed terms. It is not the forbidden riba. So that's clearly wrong. And if we go back to writings of Taqiyuddin al-Subki in Takmilat al-Majmu' al-Nawawi, you'll find that this was something people had mentioned in previous centuries, was thoroughly debunked, but it got revived in the 20th century and somehow stuck. Another one is return without risk. You say you can't deserve return without risk. Anybody who's had a first course in economics or finance recognizes that there is credit risk. When you lend somebody with interest, it doesn't mean you're not taking a risk. They may be bankrupt, they may not have assets to pay you back. There is risk. So that's not the explanation. The prohibition is still there. I'm not saying we're going to wipe it out. I'm just saying the explanations that were given and the consequences of those explanations are not really well grounded in Islamic thought at all. Exploitation of the poor. Of course, exploitation of the poor is still possible. Even if you don't use riba in the forms that jurists recognize, you can still exploit the poor. Again, Taqiyuddin Subki gives the example. You can always trade in camels. Give somebody a camel today, get 5 in a year. It's a 400% interest rate. But it's not forbidden because camels are not among the ribawi goods and you cannot get there by any reasonable form of reasoning by analogy. Just some self-promotion. I tried to write some papers to analyze the juristic texts as well as provide some economic rationale to try to explain what those prohibitions were. And in my humble opinion today, I think that the prohibition of riba is really about two things. One is collateralization, sort of linking financial and real activities. And the other is the concept of marking to market, that the rate of return on money has to be linked to the particular economic activity that's being financed, and that's why you have different rates of return. But that, of course, is done also in conventional finance. It's just that Islam has built in financial regulations in this form. And the prohibition of gharar is sort of trying to avoid some types of individual irrationality when dealing with risk, that people treat risk ex post and ex ante in two different ways. But anyway, I won't bore you with the technical details. I presented them elsewhere, and you can read the papers if you're interested. But the worst thing that I believe historical Islamic economics did was to convince jurists that there is a viable, radical Islamic alternative. That today you can establish a full economic system that looks nothing like Western financial and economic systems, but that is viable. And jurists, not being experts in economics, read those articles and books and were convinced that somehow, yes, that system does exist. And so you'll see again from the opinions as I go through a case study that jurists are thoroughly convinced that those writings in Islamic economics are, number one, good economics, and that they prove that there is a radical and viable alternative. And then they insist that that's the alternative we have to use. So the case study I want to give is something that for research I'm doing now. I'm not going to bore you again with the technical details either on the jurisprudence side or on the economic side, but I'll show you examples of fatwas. And I've chosen only fatwas that are available on the internet, so you can go on your own and look them up, that show how muddled jurist thinking is and how the writings in Islamic economics actually, I believe, were the perpetrators of this confusion. The solicited fatwas, let me just mention very quickly, I don't have much time. Bonds have, it's like light, has different, you can look at it as particles or waves. Money can be looked at, bonds can be looked at as money, or they can be looked at as debt. They sort of live two lives, especially in the world of fiat money, and I'll get back to the issue that was mentioned earlier about fiat money versus commodity money. But certainly in the world of fiat money, there isn't a whole lot of difference between cash and bonds. I mean, think about it. You can either carry, if you're going to hold $10,000 for a year, you can either put it, in a $100 pack of $100 bills signed by the Secretary of the Treasury, or you can hold it in a Treasury bill held by a Secretary of the Treasury that will pay $10,000 at that same point. Two debts on the same entity signed by the same person paying the same amount in a year. The only difference is about liquidity. Now, there are lots of things that are wrong with bonds. It's a form of taxation of the poor and so on, because the poor usually can't sort of... What money is an indefinite debt that the government basically gets to use any way it wants, whereas the bond at least is linked to that money. But I'm not going to get into the details. The important thing is that you can see from the solicited fatwas, just by reading the fatwas, you can guess what people ask them about. And you can see that the governments and the the banks are very dissatisfied with the way jurists are thinking, and they're trying to find all sorts of tricks. And that's how I'm going to conclude that that's the big disease in Islamic finance today. So the first thing is jurists always keep using the term money is not a commodity. Money is not a commodity. But then, as we heard earlier, the consensus opinion now is that it has the same rules as gold and silver, which are commodity monies. By the way, all 6 commodities mentioned in the hadith of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri that was mentioned earlier were used as commodity monies at some point in time or another. Dates, salt, and so on, they were all used as commodity monies at different times. So it's not only gold and silver that can be used as numerators and were used historically as numerators. Especially, for instance, in North Africa, salt was a very popular money because they have those salt pillars that you can cut into nice coins that can last for a long time. Anyway, so they simultaneously say it's not a commodity while they're commodifying it. And then when they're asked about trading different currencies for one another, they say, no, they're different genera. It's okay. You're not trading debts for debts because a US dollar and a Kuwaiti dinar are sort of like trading gold for silver. You still have to obey the rules of sarf, but it's okay. So they treat them like different genera, but at the same time, a single government is not allowed to issue 2 different currencies and then determine the rate of exchange any way they want. That's how the Medicis basically got around the rules of prohibition of riba in the 15th century. So simultaneously, again, they allow different countries somehow to issue different genera. It's as if they can create different metals that are now analogous to gold, but one country cannot do it. Of course, if the country gets independent, issues 2 currencies, somehow magically that same money became 2 different genera, as if commodities are arising out of thin air. The other thing they do is whenever they don't understand something, they go back to Sadd al-Dhara'i. They say, we're not sure how you're going to use this. You're a banker. We're suspicious. We think you want to do riba under another name, and you just want us to approve it. So if we don't understand it, we say it's forbidden. So here are a few interesting fatwas. You can tell what's going on. Kuwait Finance House asks, well, can we redeem bonds in a different currency? Of course, the Sharia board is known to be one of the strictest. They say, no, you can't do that. Here's a place where clearly the jurists are strongly influenced by what Islamic economists are doing. Rajhi asks, well, how can we participate in paying the fiscal deficit of the Saudi government? And they say, oh, there are all these mudaraba bonds and so on based on profit and loss sharing. Those are things that are created in the Islamic Development Bank, not particularly good economics. Again, it's just basically populist writing for people who want to believe what's written ex ante. But it doesn't stand the scrutiny of any careful economic analysis. They got away with one. They asked them, well, is platinum the same as gold and silver, or is it different? They told them, no, it's different. So there you go. You can have 2 currencies, one based on gold standard and the other based on a platinum standard. You can do anything you want with those. So again, you can go and check all these fatwas if you want. Here's another fatwa that's very interesting. I told you that bonds can be viewed both as money and as debt. They decided that debt is indeed a loan. So that's one of the problems. I said that they try to always squeeze everything into those same chapters that they have in their books of jurisprudence. So they decided that, and I'll just give you a whole slew of those. So positive coupon bonds are loans. 0 coupon bonds are loans. Those are like treasury bills. Bonds that pay unpromised prices, like the Malaysian government investment certificates or the Egyptian Ahli Bank Type C investment certificates and so on. He said, no, they are loans that benefit, still forbidden. And then again, they refer to that alternative that they're now convinced by those writings in so-called Islamic economics that this is a viable and fundamentally different alternative. We can have these mudaraba bonds that will do the job. Of course, they won't, and I won't bore you with why you can't build a fiscal policy with that or a monetary policy. In one of the most insightful of the contemporary jurists, rahimahullah, Sheikh Mustafa Zarqa, shortly before passing away, was asked by the Jordanian government about issuing treasury bills. And again, the language is very interesting because he thought about it for a long time and said, it cannot really be classified as anything other than a loan. So again, maybe the economics was not presented to him in the best possible way, but at least he recognizes that there are different ways of thinking about it. And then he goes through saying all other loans or other bonds have the same loan status, and then, as with all other contemporary jurists, attacks the Imam al-Azhar, Sheikh al-Azhar, as to the point of raising doubts about his knowledge and faith, because he disagreed. He just he reached a different juristic opinion based on the same evidence. And again, recommends musharaka and mudaraba, and you can see referring to Dr. Omar Chapra's book on just monetary system. Again, as if somehow that's a text that from which you can infer juristic rulings. So in my opinion, what has happened now is that economists have borrowed the worst traits of jurists, and jurists have borrowed the worst traits of economists. So jurists have adopted the worst traits of economists. Economists, when asked about something, they like to give a quick answer, knowing that they can always change the answer later. Nobody takes them too seriously. Everybody knows that every economist has two hands. He says on the one hand and on the other hand. The analysis we heard earlier from Brother Yunus was very similar to the vision of what fiat money is in Goethe's Faust. I advise you to read it. That this was a diabolical plot to convince the emperor that he can issue paper money on gold that's not even been extracted from the land, and how that allowed the emperor all sorts of luxuries and so on. But I won't bore you with the details. The other thing is, again, seeking temporary solutions to permanent problems. When the government calls you and Council of Economic Affairs calls you and says, we need to solve this problem, you know it's a permanent problem, but you have to give them a solution right away. And jurists, unfortunately, have been doing this. They are asked, what do we do? And they say, here's what you do, mudaraba bond, whatever. They don't even think about what are the economic consequences, does it do the job? On the other hand, economists have adopted the worst traits of jurists. While jurists often, you read that they say that what really matters are the meanings, العبرة بالمعاني وليس بالألفاظ, that it's not the name of the contract that matters, it's the substance. In reality, what the jurists today are doing is precisely looking only at the names. They split hairs over whether or not you can call something murabaha, rather than just look at it and say, does it contain riba or not? That's what I really care about. Let's call it contract number 1. It doesn't matter what you call it. But unfortunately, economists got tangled in this. So they have all these different constructions that they've been developing, very much to cater to those jurists who are doing the worst things economists do. And the other thing is absolutism in defining what's Islamic. Money is a new phenomenon. And we heard earlier Mr. Yunus talk about paper money. I'll have to finish 1 minute. Money, as we know it today, was really invented in the 20th century. And people talk about paper money as if that's what's new. As of 1999, only 8% of the total volume of dollars in the world actually existed in physical form, paper or otherwise, paper, coin, anything. The rest are just blips on somebody's computer chip. And to try to decide that we know for sure what is Islamic and what's not Islamic in that completely new context so quickly is just presumptuous. Let me skip all of this and say what. How about this one? 2 more slides. I'll go very quickly. So what I'm wondering is whether or not we can recognize that everything that's not in a text is probable. All human knowledge is probable, even if the best jurists of the century all agree on it based on faulty economic analysis by economists and by the jurists themselves. We have to recognize this is probable, it is not certain. We do not know that something is Islamic and something is not Islamic unless there is a clear and unequivocal text about it. We have to overcome the outdated suspicion of everything that's Western. We have to overcome the urgency of always saying, yes, it's Islamic, or no, it's Islamic. It's not Islamic. I wish jurists would say, I don't know, every now and then, but they don't. And I would really like that we stop writing apologetic economics papers. And I do that. That's what I do when I put on my hat of Islamic economics. A good economist can write a model to justify anything. I can justify something and justify its opposite because I know how to play with the math. And playing this apologetic game doesn't fool anybody. I think we need to get beyond that and really get to the heart of the thing. What is the Sharia really about, and what really is Islamic and not Islamic? And let me jump to the last slide and say if jurists were to adopt the best traits of economists instead of the worst, and economists were to adopt the best traits of jurists instead of the worst, then jurists will become skeptical about their own writings, even if it's in Ibn Taymiyyah or if it's in Nawawi or if it's Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya or whoever it is. This was the thinking of somebody during that time. We have better economic research today, And so whatever part of that decision was based on economic reasoning can easily be abrogated because it's human reasoning and replaced by the state-of-the-art knowledge, just like we do in medicine and other areas. You can see the early opinions on say, transferring a kidney, and the more modern opinions as jurists got to consult more economists. So that's the second, more physicians. The second point is that when economists have a problem, when Malaysia or any country, or Indonesia, any country has a problem, what they do is they consult the best in the business. They get the best economists out there to come and try to solve their problem. They say, this is our problem, this is what we want to do, according to the state of the art. Unfortunately, we're still trapped in suspecting everything that's Western, and therefore we have, quite honestly, and I'm in that category, mediocre economists who are going out there and trying to create a system, and we're not using the best talents in the world. So if jurists will listen to the best economists instead of just listening to people who share their rhetoric, their name, and their ideology, that will help them a lot in understanding the real economic situation. And then if economists were to adopt the best traits of jurists, they would actually follow what jurists write down rather than what they say, and look at the functions rather than the forms. Stop all this stuff about ijara, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's nonsense. Let's just look at what is really the essence of what's forbidden, and let's see if you can build an economic environment where you don't use what's forbidden and use what is allowed. And the other thing is that jurists always, at least again in writing, try to look at the overall social and economic costs and benefits rather than look very narrowly. And Professor Siddiqui spoke about this earlier. People tend to write to champion a certain political ideological case, and they just write an apologetic piece in order to say, oh yeah, sure, I can do this with an ijara bond or whatever. But I think we really need to sit down and think deeply about the issue. And if we don't publish anything about this for 100 years, so much the better. And if we don't have another Islamic bank for another 100 years, I think so much the better. Let's, when we do it right. Thank you very much.